Hello, I'm Dr. Ahmed Abdelal, and today we are going to speak about the third part of the neuroanatomy, and we focus on the cortex of the cerebrum, or otherwise known as the cerebral cortex, and the cranial nerves. I recall that in section 2, in part 2, I spoke about the divisions of the nervous system, the anatomic and functional divisions, and we spoke about the big pieces of it. So we spoke about the cerebrum as the biggest part of the hemispheres, like the right hemisphere, left hemisphere. These are parts of the cerebrum. I mentioned that if you look at the brain stem, the diencephalon, which is made of the thalamus and hypothalamus, and then the cerebellum, everything above that, all of the big structure around this is the cerebrum. And I mentioned that part of the cerebrum, the very top layer of the cerebrum that you are looking at here, that is 4 millimeters thin or thick, 4 millimeters. That is the cortex of the cerebrum, the cover. And we call it also the gray matter. And beneath it, there's the white matter, blah, blah, blah. So now we will speak about the cerebral cortex, the structure of it, the locations, the geography of it, and we speak about the functions as well. In this part, we also will speak about the cranial nerves. So the cerebral cortex has 4 visible pieces and 2 invisible, 2 that you cannot see on the surface. So the first part is the frontal lobe, and then the second is the parietal lobe, and the occipital lobe, and the temporal lobe. All of these are named after the bones, the pieces of the skull that covers them: the frontal bone, parietal bone, occipital bone, and the temporal bone. So these are anatomic nerves. You can also name each part as simply cortex: frontal cortex, temporal cortex, parietal cortex, and visual cortex. Occipital cortex. So let's look at the other parts, and then we'll come back. So here is another part. If you open up the 2 hemispheres, in between the left hemisphere, right hemisphere, you find a gyrus that is continuous and it's over the corpus callosum. And that gyrus is called the cingulate gyrus, unique, cingulate, single. And then there is another, so here's again the cingulate gyrus, and goes from front to back to front. Here is when you open the temporal fissure, pull it down and pull up the pieces of the frontal and parietal cortex, put them up, you find the hidden area underneath. And that area is called the insula, or the insular cortex. So these are the 6 pieces, 6 parts of the cerebral cortex. So the cerebral cortex, even though it is thin, it has the overwhelming majority of cell bodies. And this is why it has a lot of oxygen, a lot of glucose. This is why it looks pearl gray. And this is why we call it the gray matter. Beneath it, of course, is the white matter, because all the cell bodies, they extend their axons down, and the axons are insulated with the myelin, and this is why they are white. We call that the white matter. So in the cerebral cortex, we have all the functions that make us human, and that we have the most extensive cortex that is known, and it is folded numerously here to make room so that it can expand the surface. So it gives us the ability to think and evaluate our thoughts. It gives us cognition, the ability to store knowledge and to access and remember knowledge. Language functions, to comprehend and to speak and to write and so on. Emotional processing, controlling our emotions and feeling our emotions. Sensory functions like sensation from all different parts of the body inside and out. And motor planning and motor functions and so on. So these are the general functions, but we will go to every part and know the specific functions that it is specialized in. So when you look at the brain, you notice on the cerebral cortex, you notice it is folded and convoluted. So the areas that are protruding up are called gyri. One is a gyrus, and more are called gyri. The areas that are between gyri, these little valleys, are called sulci, and one is called sulcus. When the sulcus or the valley is a deep groove, we call it fissure. But sometimes people use the same name for both. Some people use sulcus, but fissure is a deep groove. For example, this groove in between the right hemisphere and left hemisphere is called the longitudinal fissure. So the longitudinal fissure is the longest and the most extensive one that separates the cerebrum from the front to all the way to the back, and it's very deep. It doesn't seem like very deep here, but because the brain doesn't have much to hold it, it's just slouching and you can't see clearly. So then we have the central fissure, and the central fissure divides the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe and extends from the longitudinal fissure superiorly down to the temporal fissure, and it's transverse, it's this kind of perpendicular on the temporal fissure. You need to understand these fissures. We use them as ways to explain the landmarks. So if you give me a description and say, here's how to find where the primary motor cortex is, or the precentral fissure is, precentral gyrus is, then you need to describe it to me. So when I look at your description and I look at a brain, I am able to identify that location from many, many other locations by your description. So the description of the anatomy has to be absolutely precise. So the central fissure or central sulcus also has different names, like the Rolandic fissure or the fissure of Rolando. In front of the central fissure, there is a gyrus, this gyrus here. That is called the precentral gyrus, the gyrus in front of the central fissure, the precentral gyrus. And we are going to know this in terms of the function. We know this as the primary motor cortex. Behind the central fissure, there is another lobe, another gyrus that is known as the central gyrus. That is anatomy. And functionally or physiologically, that is known as the primary somatosensory cortex, or the primary sensory cortex. And we'll describe this later. So then, then we have the temporal fissure. The temporal fissure is also called the Sylvian fissure, or the fissure of Sylvius, or the lateral fissure. All of these are names, but the most common names are the lateral fissure or the temporal fissure. And it separates the temporal lobe from the frontal lobe and from the parietal lobe. So you need to know, when you are asked about these fissures, you need to exactly identify where do they extend, where do they lie, what do they separate. The parieto-occipital sulcus is, as if from the name, it's a fissure or sulcus that divides the occipital lobe from the parietal lobe, right here, between the green line and the purple line here. And it is perpendicular to the longitudinal fissure. So the longitudinal fissure is here, that's perpendicular to it. And it extends inferiorly to the edges of the temporal cortex, like here. So again, it separates the occipital lobe from the parietal lobe. So now we are going to speak about the 6 major divisions of the cortex, and we'll speak about the anatomic location. What does each part look like? What it is surrounded by. So it is like this. This is how you need to describe it, the anatomy. Imagine there is a plot of land, and I would like to locate that plot of land, and there's a whole big area there, in a desert or in a forest. And then you give me a description and say, here, this is what you have, so you can locate that land. That land has no landmarks. It doesn't have anything written on it, but it is your job with your description to enable me to go there and locate it and say, this is the piece exactly that I'm looking for. And then we describe the function of it. So we'll begin with the cingulate gyrus and also move on to the insula, and then we go on to the lobes. And after that, we speak about the cranial nerves. So the cingulate gyrus is buried inside the longitudinal fissure. Of course, each hemisphere has its own cingulate gyrus. So it lies superior to and anterior to the corpus callosum, and it surrounds it like a crescent. It is specialized in many emotional functions, language functions, motor functions, and cognitive functions. The anterior segment of it is engaged in analyzing thoughts, in enabling us or helping with other areas to generate a language script. So when you are speaking, or when I am speaking now, I am not thinking about every letter I'm going to say, every sound, or every word, or every sentence. However, my brain, these areas in the frontal part of the brain are working together to assemble a script of what I am going to say in the next second or two. And it feeds the different parts of the script as I'm speaking. And this is how I become fluent as I'm speaking. So the anterior cingulate is a contributor to evaluating our thoughts, to rehearsing our thoughts, and to enable us to generate a script, a language script. So it also the anterior part contributes to emotional regulation. It plays a great role in mood regulation. The middle area here, so here's the central sulcus, continuous on the other side. Anterior to it, there is a little area here that contributes to motor planning. That area is called the supplementary motor cortex. And beneath it are two parts of the cingulate gyrus that serve motor planning functions. And they communicate with the supplementary motor cortex. So this area here contributes to motor functions, planning of movement for speech or anything else. So then we go to the insula or the insular cortex, and this is a structure that is covered and insulated or buried within the lateral fissure, okay? So if you open up the lateral fissure, you're gonna see the insula. Now there's an important structure that I'm gonna explain here. The operculum means lid, cover. The different parts, one piece here, two piece, a second piece, third piece, that cover the insula. Each one of them is called the operculum, and the three are called opercula. So here's the frontal operculum, and the parietal operculum, and the temporal operculum. The opercula are major and central language areas. They are heavily involved in processing language that is coming in and in verbal expression and so on. So frontal opercula, basically the frontal big piece of it is connected with Broca's area that we described before. Part of the temporal opercula is the primary auditory cortex and Wernicke's area. So these are critical language areas. So the insula it contributes to motor activation for speech. And it has a big connection with the Broca's area. If that pathway is severed, then the person can become mute. This area, the insula, is your center. It is called the brain default mechanism. The brain default mechanism. They described it in 1997. Accidentally, a scientist was testing someone and doing, cognitive MRI or what they call it, some kind of fMRI where they put electrodes in your brain, and then they give you tasks to say or to something to look at, and then they see how your brain, the activity to your brain. So the person was hooked up and waiting for the task. There was nothing that the person was looking at or listening to. So by chance, the scientist looked at the screen and he saw a lot of activity from this area. So by accident, they looked at this area more and they said, well, if you are not consciously paying attention, focusing on a goal, that area immediately starts to be activated. And the function of it is to connect your previous knowledge with your present time. And it brings out some information selectively that is important from your subconsciousness, and it brings it up to your conscious awareness. So that area, when we stare, that is an area that is heavily engaged, and it enables us to kind of facilitate the stream of our thoughts. And as we access previous knowledge, it is an area that is heavily involved in creativity. It is a center for translating our emotions that we are not aware of, translating them, converting them into conscious emotions. We call conscious emotions that you consciously feel, we call them feelings. So it converts your emotions into feelings that you actually are aware of. So this is where when you say, oh, I really have butterflies in my stomach, it converts nervousness into physical symptoms that you actually feel. You're like, oh, it's like someone kicked me in the stomach. So in addition, it is your center for intuition and for your gut feeling. And a lot of these intuitions are accurate because the insula is connected with different parts of the brain where knowledge is stored, and it can access and take these different pieces and that you are not aware of and assembling them together, giving you a complete picture and says, this is what's going to happen. And it enables you to predict things that are generally going to happen. Now, we are going to look at the 4 lobes. We look at the boundaries, anatomic boundaries of each, and we look at major landmarks, major areas in the lobe, and we are going to speak about the functions of it as a whole and the functions of the different areas in it. So this needs a lot of attention and a lot of focus. The frontal lobe, first, is separated from the parietal lobe by the central fissure or the Rolandic fissure. It is separated from the temporal lobe by the lateral fissure. That's it. These are the boundaries. Now, what are the major stations that we are going to focus on here? First, the precentral gyrus, that area here, that gyrus, the precentral gyrus. The precentral gyrus continues, if you look here, the central sulcus is here. The precentral gyrus continues in between the hemispheres. So here. So the precentral gyrus, that is the anatomic name. In terms of the function, we know this as the motor cortex or the primary motor cortex. We'll discuss it in detail when we come to it. The area in front of the motor cortex is called the premotor area. So here's the motor area, the premotor area here, this area here, and here, and here. So the premotor cortex goes up to about here. And then another area, this is for motor planning, by the way, and parts of it also can contribute to activation. And then on top here, there is a segment on top of the premotor area called the supplementary motor cortex or the supplementary motor area, also engaged in motor planning. Then we have another very important structure that lies, see, here is the motor cortex, and the premotor area extends up to maybe a little bit here, and in front of it, see this area and this, they make up Broca's area. Notice we are looking at the left hemisphere. Broca's area is only named, only found in the left hemisphere. Do not make the mistake. and say it is in the other hemisphere. Only in the left hemisphere. That area, we call it Broca's area. Even though the right hemisphere has a mirror image of it, we do not call that area in the right hemisphere Broca's area. Only the left side of the brain. So that is Broca's area. Someone with the name Corbin and Brodmann, many years ago, at the beginning, like 1910 or something like that, way back, many decades ago, divided the cortex into particular locations, divided it into about 54 or 52 areas, anatomic areas, based on the thickness and the kind of cells of the cortex and so on. And we know these as Brodmann areas. So every component, every area that you see here has a Brodmann number that we still use. So for example, this area is called Brodmann area 44. And the next area next to it, Brodmann area 45. So I'd like you to know that Broca's area is made up of Brodmann area 44 and 45. And the location, exact location of Broca's area it is in the posterior, inferior, posterior inferior region of the frontal lobe. And it's not enough. Anterior to the foot of the premotor cortex. The premotor cortex has a little edge here. So the foot of anterior to the foot of the premotor cortex. If you do that, then you have described it perfectly. The area from here, that is, the area in front of the very front of the frontal lobe here, from here and all this, that is the prefrontal area, the prefrontal cortex, or the prefrontal cortex. In one piece of it, the cortex that integrates various cognitive, motor, emotional, different functions together, are integrated by the frontal association cortex. So the prefrontal cortex is the central executive of your entire brain, of your entire body. That is the area where you make decisions, when you make judgment, when you remember, when you pay attention, when you inhibit things that you should not do or say, and so on. That is a very critical. It's the executive director of the entire brain and the entire body. So these are the areas that you need to really pay close attention to, and you need to understand what they do and where they are located. So let's begin. The primary motor area, cortex, again, it is anterior to the central gyrus. The central sulcus, or the central fissure. Okay, and it is sometimes called, anatomic name is called the precentral gyrus, just the anatomy of it. But the function, it is the primary motor cortex. The area in blue behind it is called, that is part of the parietal lobe, that is called the post-central gyrus, but the function is, it is the somatosensory cortex. The primary motor cortex, and as I mentioned, it is continuous within the longitudinal fissure. If you look at it, say one side here, you see it as this is anterior, this is posterior. So here you see the primary motor cortex. On the other side, there's another one. And behind it, there is the blue line, is the somatosensory cortex here. So what they do here is take the primary motor cortex from this side and plot it and show it to you what it looks inside. And on the other side, they take the somatosensory cortex and put it there. Okay, so these two together, because it's difficult to put these two like this and that, but they show it in a creative way where they show one from this side and they show you the somatosensory cortex from the other side. But there are two of each. Here in between is the longitudinal fissure, and now the brain is cut like coronally, a frontal cut where you have a big flat piece frontal and big flat piece back, and then you are looking from behind. So you are looking at a slice this way. So this is what this structure is, and you are seeing it. You have a coronal view. You can see it continuous here, and that area here in pink, that is the cortex itself. The area, all the white part is the white matter. So what you are looking at now is called the homunculus, and especially the motor homunculus. Homunculus means little man in Latin, little man. So if you imagine like a little person, like, you know, putting his legs in between the hemispheres, the toe is here in between, and bending over, this is the trunk, and this is the waist, and this is the shoulders, hand and face. And that same orientation, that is a map of all the areas of your body that you move voluntarily. So that gives you a map of how the wiring that is made to move the different parts of the body, how it is plotted. So this area, for example, of the cortex is dedicated to moving your toes. And it has axons that go down and travel and travel and travel all the way to the brain stem, to the spinal cord, and you go all the way crossing the other part of the brain stem, going to the spinal cord, all the way down to your toes. Simply, it is wiring. So you have the cortex here, and the big pathway that's called the pyramidal pathway that takes all these axons, bundles them into big bundles pathways, going to the brain stem and into the spinal cord all the way to basically, you know, control your movement of your toes. In addition, there are pathways also coming with that enable you to get sensations, so you can feel your toes moving. So the connection between the cortex and the different lower areas is by the pyramidal pathways, the pyramidal pathway and the extrapyramidal pathway. So then as you go a little bit up, then the ankle, movement of the ankle, then movement of the knee, then movement of the torso, movement of the waist, and then the shoulders, and then the arm, and then look, all this area here, from here, all the way, almost 1/3 of it is dedicated to the hand. Because the hands for humans, they create everything that you can see around us. Without the hands, we wouldn't have any civilizations. So it is very, very important structure. And so it has a lot of the motor cortex is dedicated to your hand. And almost 1/3 also, the inferior 1/3 of it is dedicated to movement of the face and the lips and the nose and the tongue and the vocal folds and all of this. So let's go back here. This is the structure we speak about. And we said the person is sitting here dangling his or her feet between the two hemispheres. And here would be the torso, here will be the waist, the shoulders, and this area will be dedicated to the hand. And this area from here all the way down is dedicated for speaking and feeding, feeling your face inside and out, and in front of it, right here, is Broca's area. So it makes sense that Broca's area is located in a way that it can communicate with the motor cortex, and it can give it the template so that it can move muscles of speech. So that is the motor homunculus. It is just an imaginary map of the body that is overlaid on the motor cortex to tell you how the map is organized, and that things are not just random. This map is very precise, and all the fibers from each segment go down to connect particular areas of the body. That is voluntary movement. Now, the somatosensory cortex, that also has a homunculus. That is called the sensory homunculus. That's also an imaginary. So here's the sensory homunculus, exactly the same. So instead of moving our toes, now that area doesn't move our toes. However, it gives us the sensation from our toes. It tells us that the toe is moving, or it has pain, or, and so on. The ankle, the whole foot, all the sensation from different parts of the feet, and then the torso, sensation from the waist, the chest, sensation from the arm, and sensation from the hand, and sensation from the face, different structures of the face and the tongue, and the vocal folds, and so on. So the motor, again, the motor cortex enables us to have voluntary movements, and parallel with that, every segment of the somatosensory cortex enables us to have sensation from that particular part that we are moving, or whether we are moving it or not. It just carries sensations from it, from the joints, from the muscles, from the skin. Okay, so you understand now what a homunculus is, and what is the motor homunculus, and what the sensory homunculus is. This is, again, that is the sensory cortex by itself. The homunculus is an imaginary, human being, little body, just overlaid on the somatosensory cortex or the motor cortex to display how every part is mapped out. So how you get sensation, or how you activate that part. The primary motor cortex is the ultimate structure responsible for movement. So if you look here, for example, here, like the structures of your face, all of the structures of your face, every part, your tongue, for example, there are neurons here, cell bodies, that plan and do, make plans and movements and stuff, and they send axons down. These axons are bundled together. They go down as part of the pyramidal tract, and they travel down to your tongue, go to the other side of your body. They go the other side, and they travel through a cranial nerve that controls your tongue, goes directly. So whatever you do here, like you want to move your tongue, here you have the command, the button, and you press the button, the signal goes down, 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 until you go and you move your tongue. So that is the primary motor cortex. And before, the areas before it, the premotor areas, are dedicated to planning of movements before you do these movements. And there are several areas for planning. So the premotor area, some of its neurons, see, this is the pyramidal tract. Some of the neurons of the premotor area come down as to become part of the pyramidal tract that connects the cortex with the lower parts of the brain and body, the parts that you want to move. So this this area here, in addition to planning for motor commands, it actually has a bundle of fibers that are engaged in the physical activation of muscles and structures. So in addition to planning, it contributes to the pyramidal tract by providing fibers to contribute to the movement itself. Then this area, again, it contributes to, as I said, the activation of movement, but it also has a very important pathway, a very important pathway that connects it from here, connects it with the posterior part of the parietal lobe. So it connects it with this area here. This area is basically the association cortex of the parietal lobe, called the somatosensory association cortex. So it is connected with the premotor area. So what happens is, before you perform a movement, your brain is going to map out the area that surround you. It is going to map up the locations. Like, I'm going to move my hand. Am I going to have enough, for example, space to move it? Can I move it? How high am I going to move it? Is there something that's going to restrict my hand? Do I have the physical ability to move my hand? And so on. All of these things are evaluated. But the parietal cortex, especially the somatosensory association cortex, it creates maps of the outer space and the muscle or the structure of the body that it moves in. Like the tongue, for example, it has, boundaries here, boundaries there, boundaries above, boundaries down, boundaries in front. So it knows the space around the tongue. In addition, it knows the movements of the tongue. The tongue can have the ability to move this way or that way, up and down and back and front. And so it produces maps. And these maps are sent out to the premotor area. The premotor area takes these maps and plans out the movements that you want to do. Or I want to say, la, 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 la. How do I say that? La, la. Before I say it, it has to be planned. So the frontal cortex, the prefrontal cortex, with Broca's area, with the supplementary motor area, with the premotor cortex, with the cingulate gyrus, with Wernicke's area, all of these together work together to plan a motor script. Before you perform any movement, whether you're moving your hand, moving your tongue, moving your lips, before making any movement that is planned, you make a movement, a motor script first. It's called the simulation or a simulated script. And it runs it and it compares it to the ability or muscular force, muscular ability, with everything that, for example, that can constrict your movement. And then it gives you the best scenario, the most efficient, that you can do fast and that you can do accurately. These are the two things. And there's a major motor principle that says the faster you become, the less accurate that you can be. So as you keep increasing and increasing speed, you are going to have to sacrifice accuracy. And this is where we make a lot of adjustments as we speak, and abbreviations here, abbreviations there, and we create accents and dialects and based on that. So that is, in addition, the premotor area serves as a depository, as a place to store memories of previous movements that you did, so that you don't have to learn them every time that you make the movement. So that is a critical function that it has. And once that motor script is made and it is checked out and it's all edited, then it goes into, it is passed by Broca's area to the speech areas. And then now these neurons in this area here are going to be activated, and now your tongue or your lips are going to be doing the movements in the same sequence that you wanted them to make. So then the supplementary motor area, as you see here, it lies superior to the premotor cortex and anterior to the motor cortex, and it also extends between the two hemispheres. And you can see the cingulate gyrus, the two areas I mentioned before, parts of the cingulate gyrus that have motor functions that communicate with the supplementary motor area, and they contribute to the planning, to the generation of the motor script for speech, when to speak and how to speak, how do you do it, and all that sequencing and so on. So the supplementary motor area works together with Broca's area, with the premotor area, with the frontal cortex, with Wernicke's area here, to generate the motor script for speech. And also it edits the command. For example, it says, oh, you don't have the motor skills to do that. You do not have the muscular force to actually do this. You might not be able to sequence it in this way or that way. So it contributes to editing of the motor script, and actually also contributes to editing of the verbal script as well, thinking out what you want to say. So, and you could see here in on this image how Broca's area is connected to so many other areas, and then it's connected with the motor, the premotor area, and then it will be also connected to the part of the motor cortex that has to do with your face and your tongue and the parts of communication. And you can see also it's connected with the somatosensory cortex. So now we look at the prefrontal cortex, and this is the blue area here, and this is your area, the central commander of your body and your brain. This is the area that determines what you remember, what you forget. It controls your emotional processing system, controls your the hippocampus. It tells it what to store for long term, what not to store. It enables you to have alertness and awareness, to be aware of who you are, where you are, to be oriented to space and time, and so on. It enables you to have attention, to regulate and control your emotions. For example, there are two pathways that connect this area with the amygdala that I mentioned earlier. One pathway begins maturing early, like very early in life, and extends from the amygdala to the prefrontal cortex. So because it starts from the amygdala, it allows the amygdala to tell the prefrontal cortex what emotional condition you are in. Oh, I feel really terrible. I feel this. I feel agitated. That. So it tells it. However, the prefrontal cortex has no way to control. So the child will have tantrums and will be out of control and doesn't think and so on. But the magic age of 14 or 15 comes, then there's a pathway that originates on the prefrontal cortex and goes down to connect onto the amygdala. That pathway becomes completed in construction by age 14 or 15. And this is where the person goes and says, I am not a child anymore. I am going to control what I have, what I'm going to do. I'm not going to just having tantrums. I can use words. So this is where you start to use your thoughts to control your emotions and to kind of, be more, to not to exhibit your emotions in a negative way. So the prefrontal cortex enables you to inhibit verbal inhibition, certain things that you should not be saying, and to inhibit motor movements, to inhibit behavior, certain behaviors that are not acceptable. So all of this happens in the prefrontal cortex. It gives you motivation as it communicates with the amygdala and the lower emotional centers there. It also gives you the ability to solve problems. It gives you the ability to make judgments, to evaluate options, and to come up with the best decision. Social communication, you can't imagine how much focus and attention that are involved in social communication. You need, for example, to pay attention to what the person is saying, what you are saying, what is going on around you, what happened before, what the knowledge that you have before about the person and the topic and so on. A lot of things take place in social communication. So the frontal lobe of the brain, because it also enables you to have working memory, short-term memory, it enables you to regulate social communication. If someone has a frontal brain injury as a result of car accident or hit to the frontal part of the head, then you can imagine how these functions will be impaired. You can name them. And you can see it very clearly in the social communication. The person they could be obscene, they could be just wouldn't care. A lot of problems would happen as a result. And the integration of language and cognitive abilities, all of that takes place here. And of course, this is just a summary, but you can read an entire volume, an entire book about the functions of the prefrontal cortex. Then we come to Broca's area. We have spoken about it a lot, and this is the central area for speech. Traditionally, people would tell you, oh, Broca's area is dedicated to expression, verbal expression, and grammar. And that's it. But that is not the case. Broca's area, yes, it is central. It is the central hub for grammatical processing. It has grammatical rules. It enables you to develop grammatical rules and to store them. It has your lexicon or the dictionary, mental dictionary. And if you have more than one language in the same area, Broca's area, it is going to have different compartments for different languages. So, however, you cannot speak without communicating with your comprehension. Your brain has to show that you are comprehending what you are saying. So you have to rely on the areas of comprehension and speech recognition. And these areas will help you rehearse what you are going to say before you say it. They help you assemble the words and the sounds into words and then feed them into Broca's area so that you can recognize what you want to say and so on. So both areas are engaged in expression. You cannot separate comprehension from expression, in other words. So this is the area that lies in the posterior, inferior region of the frontal lobe. Particularly, it lies in front of the foot of the premotor area, or the premotor cortex, and in front of the foot of the primary motor cortex. It is made up of Brodmann area 44 and 45. And you saw when we spoke about hearing, how the dorsal pathway from the superior temporal gyrus, how it connects with area 44, and the ventral pathway connects onto area 45. So these areas are extensively connected, the dorsal and ventral streams. What Broca's area does, in addition to having the lexicon and the grammatical rules, and identifying grammatical categories and so on, it has the program for motor activation of speech, for speech. When I say program, it means it doesn't move things. It is like you have a software program that you install for a printer. So that software program, you store it into your computer, and then when you go to the program and click a button, it goes physically, it causes the copy machine to go and pull papers and bring them this way and that way, simply by activating that program. So what Broca's area does, it has the programming for speech movements, and that is that the script, as I explained, it was made by the premotor areas, supplementary motor cortex, parts of the cingulate gyrus, and the prefrontal cortex. And then Broca's area also is helping, Wernicke's area is helping. Finally, that script goes to Broca's area, and Broca's area then feeds it into the motor cortex, and Broca's area just stops. It sends the word and stops, sends the word and stops. So it sends the word, and then the motor cortex then is activated, and then it sends the command down to through the axons, through the nerves, that then the brainstem, and from the brainstem it goes to the cranial nerves that control the muscles of the lips and the cheeks and the tongue and the vocal folds, all these muscles. So that is motor programming for speech, in addition to grammatical processing and lexical processing and lexical storage. That is, this area is critical. It doesn't exist in the left and the right hemisphere. Only we have one Broca's area, and it only exists in the left hemisphere. Then we have the temporal cortex, or the temporal lobe, and that lobe, most of it is dedicated to auditory processing, to memory, and emotional processing. So it has three lobes: the superior temporal lobe, the medial or middle temporal lobe, and the inferior temporal lobe. The superior, as we saw before, in the center of it, in the middle of it, you have the primary motor cortex. You can go back to my video on the auditory central nervous system, and you identify the primary auditory cortex. And posterior to the primary auditory cortex, and the posterior part of the superior temporal gyrus, this one, that is Brodmann area number 22, a very important structure that we know as Wernicke's area, that is dedicated to the comprehension, recognition and comprehension of speech, and we'll discuss the functions. So this is an area here, 22. Then the auditory association cortex is in the middle temporal gyrus, and then if you go inside of the temporal lobe, deeper in. You're in that temporal just, you're gonna find the hippocampus, and they're gonna find the amygdala. So the hippocampus, your memory processing center or your memory encoding center, communicates with the association cortex here, area 21, Brodmann area 21. And the association cortex communicates with Wernicke's area and with the primary auditory cortex. Together, they enable Wernicke's area to combine sounds into syllables and words. And the association cortex and the memory center, the hippocampus, are able to get the meaning of that word. And then Wernicke's area sends the meaning of that word to Broca's area here. And then they keep going back and forth. So, okay, I got a word, cat. What is that? Oh, it's a noun. You can put it in this part of a sentence. You can put it in that. You can use a for it, a cat, or the cat that goes with it. You can use it as a subject, as an object, and so on. So these two work absolutely together. This area again, temporal cortex, is dominant for auditory processing and speech recognition and the comprehension of language. And you cannot produce language without comprehending what you want to say. If I am speaking and I cannot recognize the meaning of what I am saying by having Wernicke's area and these areas help me, I'm going to speak nonsense. So whether you are speaking or you are comprehending silently, these two areas, the verbal expression areas, have to work with the comprehension areas. So Wernicke's area, again, it lies in the posterior segment of the superior temporal gyrus, and it is posterior to the auditory cortex, the primary auditory cortex, and you could see the connections between it and lower areas here. You know, the connections that go to the auditory association cortex. You can see also the pathways, the major pathway that connects it with Broca's area. That pathway is called the arcuate fasciculus, the arch pathway. And this is a major pathway that is two ways, a two-way street. It enables Broca's area to send information to Wernicke's, and it enables Wernicke's to send information to Broca's. So, in a sense, you could see the arcuate fasciculus connecting the temporal cortex with the parietal cortex with the frontal cortex. It's a major, major pathway. So, Wernicke's area, again, is dedicated to phonemic assembly, combining single words sounds into a word. Working with the auditory association cortex to create meaning, to get the meaning of a concept and pair it together and send it to Broca's. And it contributes to oral expression because it is part of the rehearsal, the language rehearsal mechanisms. It enables you, it works with the other areas to give you a script of what you are going to say before you say it. It's like you are driving to the drive-through and you're going to order something at a fast food restaurant. Before, as you go, you are aware probably of yourself. Say, oh, this is what I'm going to say. I'm going to say, she's going to tell me, what do you want? Can I do this and that? And then say, oh, I want this and this and this and that. So you get yourself ready, consciously, of course. But your brain does this for you on a regular basis without your awareness, and it does it so fast, in seconds. So as you continue speaking, your brain continues to generate scripts and enables you to continue speaking. So that also Wernicke's area contributes to written language as well. It also enables you to monitor your verbal output, to know that you are making the sounds accurately, to know that what you are saying is making sense to you. If you do not have that ability to monitor, you think you are making sense, but you keep talking and talking. I would like you to go to YouTube and write Wernicke's aphasia, Wernicke's aphasia patient, and then listen to some of the patients as they speak. Their words they produce nonsense words, and they think they are making sense because they don't have the auditory feedback that gives them the ability to monitor what they are saying. The parietal lobe is your sensory, it has everything to do with sensation. Why do you see the arcuate fasciculus as it passes? It goes to the parietal lobe and then it goes to the frontal. So let's say there's a word. You say, oh, a pen. What's a pen? I'm gonna write the word pen. Or so you think of it, I'm going to write the word pen. How do I do that? So immediately, even before doing anything, that is gonna, Wernicke's area will give you combines it together, pen. And then you get the meaning from the other areas. And then in the somatosensory cortex, it gives you it makes you imagine what it is like to hold the pen, how you hold it. And as you move to write the word, curving, going up, coming back, going down, and all these movements, you feel them here in the somatosensory cortex. And all of this, as you keep going, Broca's area will say, oh yeah, you can put the before pen because it's a noun. You can put pen at the beginning of the sentence because it's a subject, and so on. So this is where you integrate comprehension with reading, writing, and verbal, the meaning of the language. So as I mentioned before, the parietal cortex has maps of movements, and it maps every part of your body in space. It communicates with your joints, with your muscles, how they move, with your skin, the sensations that you get from different parts of the body. And they are plotted on the somatosensory homunculus, and also the different parts. You have the association, the somatosensory association cortex that enables you to integrate vision with touch and movement, and with hearing, with different functions. So, and as I mentioned, the prefrontal gyrus or the somatosensory cortex is part of the auditory cortex, but it has a systematic way of map that controls the different part, that gives you sensations from different parts of your body. So again, here, if you take the somatosensory cortex, look at it this way, you can see every part. All of these are cell bodies, and they send down axons, and these axons go down to the organs, muscles, and so on. Let's say lips. So you see the arrows coming up. That means sensation goes from here and goes up to the areas. So you notice here arrows going down. That means you have a motor command that is coming from these areas, and then it goes down to muscles and structures so it can move them. So this brings up sensation. This brings up motor commands. But it's just like electrical wiring. Think of it this way. So the general functions of the parietal lobe include the ability to locate objects, for example, even if you are not looking. The ability to read things with your fingertips. Like if you close your eyes and I put something in your hand, on your fingertips here, fingertips, you have sensory stations that actually can help you read information and send the information through your arm, the sensory nerves, to the spinal cord, to the brain. And then you kind of feel and say, oh, I am holding a penny, I'm holding a nickel, I'm holding a dime. So you can feel without seeing. You notice if you give someone something, and I do the experiment in the classroom, I put, like, say, something in someone's hand, like, say, a quarter here. And I say, tell me what you have in your hand. They would not be able to tell you if they are closing their eyes. So I say, okay, you can do whatever you want to. And then they go like this, and they start manipulating, touching that thing with the fingertips, because these are the areas that can read. And they say, oh, I have a quarter. But if you don't allow them to do that, just have a flat hand and put anything here, they have no idea. They can't read it because that area doesn't have these sensory tips. It enables you to, so this is what I mean by manipulating objects. Integration of different senses that allows for understanding of a single concept as a whole, and that comes from the association cortex, the somatosensory association cortex, that pulls information from different sources and gives you a complete meaning. The ability to attend to more than one object at the same time, and that is component of dual attention. This area here, there's a major pathway that goes from the parietal cortex to the frontal cortex, and this major pathway is a central piece of your intelligence. So also object naming, the ability to, like, if I show you an object, you say, what is that? You are able to name it. Object naming. The ability to locate words while you are reading or writing, because that enables you to move your eyes and go left and right and down and up and so on. It enables you to locate things in space. Ability to draw objects. Spatial processing, like, you know, your left to go right. Don't you like the GPS and Google Maps? It says, go south to this street, go north to that street. I mean, for heaven's sake, how do you know north and south and west and east? But anyways, that is what the parietal lobe helps you do. It enables you to find, for example, your car in a parking lot. It enables you to, kind of know your locations, directions, driving directions back and forth, and so on. It contributes to calculations because, again, like I said, it's has a super highway that goes from the parietal cortex to the frontal part of the brain. That is a big contributor to your IQ. It enables you to be aware of certain body parts and also the surrounding space. So that is what, like, some people don't recognize the right arm or the left arm. They have something called neglect. They just can't recognize that, that is part of their own. For example, a doctor was describing a patient in a hospital, and he said that patient came and said, was complaining like so much. He said, Doc, this person on the left, on my left here, keeps bothering me, and no one is doing anything about it. I'm just telling you. So he said, what do you mean? He said, look, every time he puts his arm on me, and the patient's arm is paralyzed completely. So the nurses come, find it hanging down on the side of the bed. They lift it up and they put it on him. And then he just looks and he realizes, oh, this is not my arm. And he throws it down. So he thinks it's the person on the next bed, laying his arm on him. So, and he also, the same patient was complaining. He said, they are not giving me any snacks. Where is my, You know, I mean, like when they bring the lunch, they are not giving him like dessert. So the doctor waited and said, okay, I'm gonna make sure that they do. So he waited and he brought the tray. They brought the tray for him, and the tray was on the left side. They had the dessert. On the right side, they had the main meal. So he would be eating, and he wasn't able to see that side where there's dessert. So then he said, after it, he said, okay, now you see, there's no dessert. So the physician said, okay, I'm going to see, I'm going to give it to him. He rotated the tray and he looked and said, oh, thank goodness. So he wasn't aware of his arm as being his own because of the damage in the parietal cortex. The ability to focus visual attention, visual search, as you look and you try to identify a word, or you are reading and focusing on particular words that you are. Eye-hand coordination, like touch your nose, touch your eye, your forehead, touch your ears. You coordinate your eyes movement with your hand movement. So if you can imagine, if there's damage to any of the parietal lobe, any of these skills can be also lost. The occipital lobe is our primary visual cortex. That is the visual cortex that is connected to the eyes, and it can move them in different ways, left and right and up and down in different ways, and the processing of depth of vision, speed of movement, and all of the visual abilities that we have. So it is located in the posterior, located in the posterior part of the brain, and posterior to the temporal cortex, and inferior to the parietal cortex, superior to the cerebellum. So it receives and processes information from your vision, and it also stores information. But before this information is stored, it goes to the hippocampus to be sorted out, to be processed, and then once it is sorted out, it will be sent back to the visual cortex to store it. You notice I said the visual cortex. That is its functional name. So occipital is the anatomic name, visual cortex is the functional name. So it contributes to higher level visual processing, like this, higher level. When you look at someone, you look at me, you can see that I am not a flat image. I have depth. You know, there's something that continues here. You could see I have depth, as I'm a three-dimensional creature. When you see something moving farther and farther away, that thing becomes smaller and smaller and smaller. That is a kind of visual, higher level visual ability. You can, so there are a lot of visual, like movement, how fast the speed is, you know, that is all processed in the visual cortex. It contributes, of course, to reading, because when you read, you have to have motor functions. Your eyes have to go left, do horizontal scanning, left and right, and they have to do vertical scanning, move from one line down and up. And also, you have to have visual acuity and all of this. That's involved in reading. It might be a good time now to pause it a little bit. You should also, when you review the video, pause it in the middle, the previous part. Maybe you can listen to it in 3 segments, but it would be a good place here to take a break and then come back and look at the cranial nerves. So the cranial nerves are 12. They are called cranial. Pay attention. Called cranial, because the roots of each of them originates on the brain stem inside of the cranium. So all of this, the roots are inside of the cranium, but each one of them gets out of the cranium and goes to connect with different parts. So basically all the nerves except two have to do with the head, face, and inside of the mouth, inside of the nasal cavity, basically. And there's one nerve that goes with the neck and the shoulders, and one nerve continues to go into your trunk. But the majority of these nerves are dedicated to your face, to your head, and to your inside of the mouth and pharynx and so on. So you could see them here. They are always labeled in Latin numerals from top to bottom. So the top one is the olfactory nerve, or sometimes called the olfactory bulb. That is for smell. The second, third, fourth, and sixth, all of these have to do with vision. So, for example, these second controls it is an optic. It controls the retina of the eye. So this third, fourth, fourth is here, and sixth. These enable you to move the eyes left, right, horizontal, and up, down, and obliquely, like at an angle. So eye movement, eye in different directions. Also controlling the pupil. So when you flash light into the pupil constricts. If it dilates when you, or it is dilated when you put the light on in it, it doesn't constrict, then there's a problem. This is what the cops look for to identify someone who is drunk, because that drinking numbs that nerve and it makes the pupils not respond to light. Or also sexual arousal will cause the pupils to be dilated. Okay, so we're not going to spend too much time on this. The first, we just tell them as briefly. The first one is the olfactory nerve that has to do with smell. The second, optic nerve 2, has to do with vision, and the acuity of vision controls the lens of the eye, and it has to do with the acuity of the vision. And then the oculomotor nerve, which is number 3, cranial nerve 3, it enables us, it controls the pupil of the eye. So it gives you reaction to light. The pupil will constrict. The movement of the eyelids, movement of the eyes up and down, and visual tracking and fixation, and also light reflexes. The light reflex from the pupil, reaction from the light from when the pupil constricts because of light. The trochlear nerve, M here means motor, S means sensory, because these nerves are classified either sensory or motor or mixed. Sensory motor or mixed. So it enables you to move the eyes downward and laterally, and the abducens enables you to move your eyes laterally as well. So this is nerve number 6. You notice that number 5 is missing, okay? So nerve 5 and all the way down to the rest of the 12 are involved in communication, in hearing or speaking. So let's take them one by one. The first one is the trigeminal nerve, cranial nerve 5, trigeminal. Geminus means twin, tri means 3. It's the 3 twin nerve. So imagine you have 3 branches on one side and 3 branches on the other side, each they make twins, like one twin here, one, and so the three twins. Trigeminal nerve, number 5. So this one has 3 branches. Remember, tri means 3. One branch is called the ophthalmic branch, and that innervates your nose and the area around the eyes and the forehead. The maxillary branch, you could see here, it innervates your maxilla, including the upper teeth. And then we have the mandibular branch, from the name, the mandible, from the jaw, and that is innervates the teeth and innervates the tongue, especially the anterior 2/3 of the tongue. So this nerve has sensory functions and motor functions, trigeminal, and the sensory functions carry information. Cutaneous means from the surface of the skin. Cutaneous and proprioceptive sensation from the skin, muscles, and the joints of the face and the mouth. So that the sensory branches of that. Again, the surface of the skin on your face, the muscles of your face. All your face is made out of muscles covered with skin, and the joints of the face, like the TMJ here, for example, the joints of the face and the mouth. So proprioception, or proprioceptive sensation or feedback, is made possible by the parietal cortex. Proprioception is your sixth sense. It is the information that you get from your muscles as they move. Well, let's use muscles of speech. Say ooh, ooh. Even if you are closing your eyes, say ooh. You feel your eyes protruded forward. You feel them rounded. I mean your lips, I'm sorry. Your lips. You feel them protruded forward. You feel them rounded. So that movement of the lips, or making them this way, that gives you sensation that goes to the sensory cortex, and it gives you that proprioceptive feedback. Oh, I am rounding my lips too much. Maybe I'm not rounding them enough. So it tells you basically what the muscle is doing. Proprioceptive feedback or sensation comes from the muscles, and to tell you what the muscle is actually doing. Or the joint, for example, like here, my jaw, as I go, e. So it tells me exactly the joint here of the jaw, as it is open to, it opens the jaw too far or not enough. That is proprioceptive feedback, comes from the joints of the body to see if the movement is beyond or is it exactly what you want. Proprioceptive feedback or sensation enables you to understand the dimensions of the body in space. Your tongue, your lips, or your whole body as you move, for example. If you don't get feedback from it to tell you what it is doing, then your movements will not be accurate. So the motor functions of the motor parts of that nerve, they activate the muscles of mastication, the muscles of chewing, and which mean the mandibular muscles and the related muscles that enable you to chew food and to crush and to grind food. Damage to this nerve causes these problems: decreased sensitivity or numbness of the face. And you notice that, of course, if you go for anesthesia, you can see what damage. And like when you go to the dentist, you get the feeling that you get, and you bite yourself and cut your tongue or your side because you are not feeling anything. You are not getting proprioceptive feedback there. Brief attacks of severe facial pain, that is called trigeminal neuralgia, that is very severe because of the damaged nerve. It keeps giving signals that there's something wrong, but the pain is very severe. Weakness or wasting of the jaw muscles, and asymmetric chewing, because one part will not be chewing with the same force as the other. That causes a problem. Then we have the facial nerve. So we moved from nerve number 5. Then 6 is a visual nerve we discussed. And then nerve number 7 is the facial nerve. This nerve is mixed. Mixed means sensory, motor, and autonomic. So these are the different branches here. So the sensory branches carry sensation from the skin of the external, this is the blue, the external ear canal. And as you keep going, the green is also sensory. And also sensation of taste from the anterior 2/3 of the tongue. Okay? Anterior ear canal and the anterior 2/3 of the tongue. Then the motor functions, the motor branches, they activate the muscles of facial expression. And we discussed the muscles of facial expression back in the articulation unit. You can go back there. So in addition to that, so that means the lips, the the lips and the risorius muscle, the zygomaticus major, zygomaticus minor, and so on. And then the stylohyoid muscle, the stapedius muscle that elicits or that causes the acoustic reflex, and the posterior belly of the digastric muscle. The autonomic branch activates the salivary glands. This is autonomic, you have no control over it. The lacrimal glands, tear glands, and the blood vessels of the cerebral cortex. The blood vessels constantly have to dilate and have to constrict. Dilate to reduce pressure, constrict to raise pressure when it is needed. So that branch controls the blood vessels inside of the cerebral cortex. Goes up. So damage to the facial nerve produces Bell's palsy, as that is one of the biggest problems. Bell's palsy, you can see the lacrimal glands that give you tears will not be active. The eyes will be dry. The inability to close the eyelids, because that nerve controls eyelid movement. It causes sound to have a booming quality because the stapedius muscle fails to tense the ossicles. You remember, it gives you the acoustic reflex. So, like when someone has tick, Lyme disease, when the tick is bitten by a tick, that usually is affected. That nerve is affected, and that can give them the symptoms when they can't close their eye. They sleep with one eye open and one eye closed, for example. Their eyes dry and all of this. So these are salivary glands we'll speak about. Then we have the vestibulocochlear nerve that we discussed extensively when we discussed the auditory central nervous system. So here you have the inner ear, including the vestibular part, and this you have the cochlear part. From the vestibular, from the 3 semicircular canals and the vestibule, you have the vestibular nerve coming out to give you sensation of movement in multi-dimensions, front, back, up, down, sideways, acceleration in different parts of space. Different. So then, as it exits the inner ear, as it exits, it gets bundled with the cochlear nerve, known as the auditory nerve. They travel in the same direction, so they get bundled together into the vestibulocochlear nerve. And when they go into the brain stem, they separate again, where you have the auditory nerve traveling now in one direction, making pathways that go up, and they make the ascending auditory pathways. So that nerve, the vestibulocochlear nerve, enables us to have sensation and about linear movement, angular and lateral acceleration in different, dimensions of space. And if there's damage there, then the person will have dizziness. And then the auditory branch, again, is dedicated to hearing. The glossopharyngeal nerve. Glossus means tongue. Pharyngeal means pharynx. So that the tongue, that the cranial nerve is number 9. That is, it innervates the tongue, parts of the tongue and the pharynx, as you could see it here, going parts of the tongue, especially the posterior. Let me ask you the question. What nerve did we discuss just a few minutes ago that innervates the anterior 2/3 of the tongue? Go back and find out. And this one innervates the posterior 1/3. And then in addition to that, it activates salivary glands, the biggest one, called the parotid gland. And that is, it lies anterior to the ear and a little bit inferior, anterior and inferior to the ear. So that is the biggest salivary gland that you have, and that nerve activates it. And also it is connected with the muscles of the pharynx, and especially the pharyngeal constrictor muscles. It innervates them. So it is mixed as well, and it has sensory, motor, and autonomic. So the sensory is, it gives you taste from the posterior 1/3 of the tongue, particularly that is sweet, bitter, and sour, and the posterior palate and fossa. That also in the posterior soft palate, and the tonsillar fossa or facial pillars. When you open your mouth, you can see the facial pillars. We discussed them in the articulation unit. So the motor segment innervates the motor branch or functions of it innervate the stylopharyngeal muscle. Styloid process and pharynx. We discussed it in the articulation unit. This muscle raises and dilates the pharynx for feeding. The autonomic innervates the parotid gland, as I mentioned, which is the biggest salivary gland that we have. The vagus nerve is a mixed nerve as well, sensory, motor, and autonomic. And as you can see, it goes down, and branches of it go into the pharynx, and go into the larynx, and they actually go onto the vocal folds themselves. So if one of these branches gets paralyzed, gets damaged, the vocal fold itself will be paralyzed. Then a major the biggest pieces of it go down into the trunk to innervate the visceral organs, including the heart, the lungs, the kidneys, the stomach, the liver, the intestines. It's an extensive nerve. So it gives you sensation from the posterior pharynx and from the larynx the thoracic and abdominal organs. It gives you taste also from the posterior tongue. So what other nerve also contributes to sensation from the posterior part of the tongue? You answered the question, I just mentioned it. Motor branches innervate the parts of the larynx and the pharynx. So remember, there are many muscles in the larynx and the muscles of the pharynx as well. Autonomic, it innervates the smooth muscles of the digestive system, as you could see, and the lungs and blood vessels of the neck and the thorax and the abdomen. All of these are innervated autonomically by that nerve. Damage to this nerve causes hoarseness because of the vocal folds. Will not be, if one vocal fold is damaged, is not able to move, then you are going to have a hoarse voice. If the two vocal folds are paralyzed, most of the time the person dies, fortunately. But there are people who have, are fortunate to survive, but it is more dangerous to have both. So mostly that is unilateral when someone has a stroke that can damage one side of the vocal fold, that gives them hoarseness. Difficulty with swallowing, loss of the gag reflex. So these are the major functions that are damaged as a result. Then now we move to the accessory nerve number 11, called the accessory nerve. The functions of it are motor, and it innervates the intrinsic muscles of the larynx and the muscles of the pharynx. So what are the intrinsic muscles of the larynx? I need you to go back, find them out, and make a complete list of them. The intrinsic muscles of the larynx. They are all activated, all innervated by this nerve. And then the muscles of the pharynx, which include the pharyngeal constrictor muscles, muscles of the soft palate, and you need to go back and find out what these muscles are. Shoulder muscles, like when you shrug like this. Lateral movements and stability of the neck, because this nerve also innervates two of the biggest neck muscles. The sternocleidomastoid, and there's another one behind it here. It's called the trapezius muscle. So because of these muscles that enable us to rotate the neck, that nerve enables us to have lateral movement of the neck and stability, makes it up. Lesions and also again shoulder movements. Lesions cause inability to turn the head away from the side of the lesion. Like say there's damage here in this nerve and this hemisphere. So that means the left side is damaged. That means this muscle is the one that is damaged. So when I want to move the neck this way, the muscles from this side, the opposite side, are gonna pull, and I can rotate. This is the side of damage. I can rotate away from the side of damage. Now this is damaged, so that means I cannot rotate the head away from the side of lesion here. The neck will become like thinner and wasted, and the muscles they atrophy, they become weaker. They would not be able to rotate well, and the inability to shrug your shoulders. That is an important part of communication. So here is the accessory nerve, the different branches. Here's the trapezius muscle, and there's the sternocleidomastoid. And then it goes